Hi there, this is Julie.
This is Tristan.
This is Vanessa.
And we're going to be looking at a comparison of online and offline recipes. To start out, we'll be looking at the aim and justification of our study. So we see that digital and physical mediums have different uses of language. From a lot of what we've seen and what others have seen, as well as what we've read in scholarly articles, people behave differently online than they do in published works. So that is to say that the Twitter feed that you look at or the Facebook feed is a lot different than the text that you'll find in a scholarly journal or in a book that's been published by an author. Also, there are differences between the language of published authors and those who may not be published. So we believe that there's a difference between the language that is used by people who have published their cookbooks than by those who just write articles on the internet about cooking, although they may not have ever been published. Also, we wanted to see if there are differences between online and physical cookbooks, and if there are, we want to know what those differences might be.
For our literature review, we had three sources. The first of which was an article written by Tomlinson called Thought for Food, a study of written instructions in the journal Symbolic Interaction. In his article, Tomlin discusses the various levels of instruction in recipes from the most basic to the most advanced. He breaks them down further by classifying them on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 being the most basic, such as just cutting an onion, to 4 actually putting together all the cooked ingredients for the final presentation of the dish. He emphasizes the importance of each, as without each level of instruction, one could not successfully complete the recipe.
The next source that we looked at was by Norwick, called Conversational Recipe Telling. This looked into family recipes and how they changed over time. An example of that was an aunt who made peanut butter pie, which had kind of been passed around. Kind of described that recipes are not only instructional, they're family history as well.
And finally, for Culver's article, A Pinch of Salt and a Dash of Plot, this one looks at the contemporary uses of narrative in cookbooks. And so Culver examines the way that cookbooks use narrative and how cookbooks themselves are kind of narratives, and also how cookbooks are social texts. So this has influenced our research by telling us that we need to keep in mind that narrative voice is used in the discourse, and that using narrative helps cookbooks be successful. So for our research questions and hypothesis, we wanted to know, how is language different between the two mediums? So what kind of linguistic features do they use in one medium that they don't use in the other? Or is there a difference at all? We also want to know if there is more personality in one medium of recipe telling over the other. So does an online cookbook present more of a subjective view on cooking than does a physical cookbook? We also wanted to look at what could account for these differences. So what could be the reason why one has more personality than the other? Or what could account for one medium having specific linguistic features that the other one doesn't? That brings us to our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is, if a recipe is physical, then it will display more linguistic elements of recipes. If a recipe is digital, then it will have more personality and display less of these linguistic features.
Okay, so then we looked at two types of sources. We looked at 4 online sources and 3 physical cookbooks. The sources, or the online cookbooks, were just kind of the most popular that we came across, and then the physical cookbooks were 3 family-used cookbooks. They ranged anywhere from intermediate to advanced, so we had a variety in between there.
For materials, really our research did not require us to use much, aside from the cookbooks, both physical and online, and a chart we created in Word to help document what linguistic features each recipe had. So from our class before about the language of recipes, we learned that each recipe typically has agency or time neutral, technical terms, pro-drop, object drop, procedural discourse, and anti-passive ergatives. So if each recipe had one of these features, we put a plus next to it. If it didn't, we put a minus.
Okay, so for our procedure, we gathered some recipes from popular cookbooks and websites that had similar recipes so that we can analyze the language between the recipes. We then gathered copies of the recipes so we could annotate and pick up the patterns, such as the common linguistic elements found in the recipes. Then we moved on to comparing our findings of what elements or recipes were present in the various sources using a chart, which was produced in the materials and instruments portion. Then we analyzed the differences between the uses of common recipe words and elements in the physical cookbooks versus the recipes we found online.
The type of data in our study. For our study, we were looking specifically at qualitative data because we were looking for specific linguistic characteristics that were present or not present in each recipe, such as the linguistic features we mentioned previously. We weren't really working with numbers in our case. As to the limitations of our study, they're very obvious. The recipes provided for this recipes were just from one family's repertoire of cookbooks, my family specifically. They ranged from the children's cookbook to Julia Child's Mastering the Arts of French Cooking. So they were limited in that we only had 4 cookbooks and 4 recipe websites for our study. The 3 types of recipes we looked at were very specific and very basic because we were looking for just a basic recipe that would be ubiquitous in all the cookbooks and websites we found them on. They were a recipe for tomato sauce, white bread, and a roasted chicken. We thought these were going to be good choices because they're relatively popular sources, although they're not very representative because not everyone uses these sources, as there are many, many different types of websites and cookbooks available. And of course, these were part of my family's collection, and every family has its own collection of special recipes.
Okay, so this was the chart that we used to distinguish between the sources that we used. My food choice, or my food that we used, was tomato sauce. This just kind of shows that all of the sources used procedural discourse. All of them also had time neutral. Most of them had pro drop in them, except for Epicurious and Women's World Cookbook, which had both. There was some.
For roasted chicken, in the blue column, these are online sources. So across the board, they all had procedural discourse and expressed time neutral. Although for ProDrop, foodnetwork.com displayed one recipe that used the pronoun you in specific cases to give directions. And then moving on to anti-passive ergative, all recipes did not have one of the examples of an anti-passive ergative, and same with Women's World Cookbook and The Joy of Cooking. So another thing that I noticed with this was that the recipes online were complicated, but they were also not very complicated. And also with the physical cookbooks, they used complicated recipes, but they also used very simple recipes with a couple of steps as well. One other interesting thing was with The Joy of Cooking, they used the word please when giving directions for one of the recipes.
For the white bread recipe, we saw similar results, except that for the online sources, we noticed that there were a lot of anti-passive ergatives that were missing at the end of the recipes. Something else I noticed, that when I was examining the children's cookbook, the ergatives were missing, the pro-drop object drops were missing, and the technical terms were missing. I would attribute this possibly towards, since the audience for the children's cookbook would be different from the other recipes, since obviously it was meant for children who would probably need a reminder that they're making or whatever they're doing needs to be a pronoun or something that they can remember physically. So a pro-drop situation may not be the best because they might forget exactly what instructions they are doing. In technical terms, obviously, they may not understand what it is to braise the chicken or julienne an onion or something like that. Another interesting point that I found was on the Epicurus' website for white bread. There were instances of both pro-drop and object drop in some cases of the recipe, while in other places of the recipe it was absent.
Okay, so for our conclusion, we found that there really wasn't much of a difference in the amount of linguistic features, but what we did find where there was differences was that the websites did seem to have more features present than those of the physical cookbooks. The physical cookbooks had more anecdotes and displayed conversational storytelling in their recipes versus the online cookbooks.
That's not to say that the online cookbooks didn't have any anecdotes or any storytelling at all, but it was a lot more common to find them in physical cookbooks. That's our presentation.
Yes.